You're listening to Death of the Reader. We are Flex and Herds. This is your Murder Mystery World Tour. And welcome back to our discussion on The Tales from Two Pockets by Karel Čapek. I got it right.
You did. Congratulations. You've officially won no points. But we're in the other pocket now. We've uncovered the deep dark hole that we're going to sit in for this week. And it's in Karel Čapek's pocket. I assume a trouser pocket.
Yeah.
Our
Our previous story was the left pocket. Now we're in the right pocket.
Yeah.
Whichever way. I don't really know how Karel Čapek organized his pockets.
It's a great question. I mean, it says the other pocket, but maybe he had like 5 pockets.
It's true. It's true.
Really more of a metaphor for the pockets of, his entire outfit. He's checked the first half of his pockets, and now it's the other half.
And it wouldn't be entirely unlike a mystery author to have a jacket with secret pockets.
Oh my goodness. Pockets with zips, pockets with buttons, pockets with secret codes you gotta type in to get in. Oh, I want this jacket now.
So this is a mystery short story collection from Karel Čapek, who is a very well-read mystery reader and decided to set his writing skills to what has been dubbed by some as an ill-fated venture into murder mystery fiction. But this collection, The Tales from Two Pockets, is said to be the best and actually good work of his in that period.
It's fantastic. I've loved reading through these stories. And speaking of, the ones we'll be looking at today are The Cactus Thief and An Ordinary Murder.
Yes.
Which we have to say like that.
Yes, you can thank Norma Bean Comrada for this translation.
Yeah.
We spoke about her on last week's episode, and it was still her efforts that translated this section of the story.
Sweet Miss Bean.
Well, Herds, let's get into the stolen cactus, or the cactus thief, or the cactus stealing.
The cactus that stole my heart.
Is that what it did? Is that what this story did?
I mean, it tickled my funny bone in a way that no story has in a while.
Yeah, I was really confused. I was really confused when you picked this story, and I was reading through it, and I was like, Herds, there's no mystery here.
No, there is no murder. There is no murder mystery. There is no murder. There's no gigantic stakes. It's just this guy telling this story about how somebody was stealing his master's cactuses, and we've got to find him and bring him back.
I would like to say there are some stakes, and they're the spikes on cacti that our culprit is impaled on.
I see. The Russian bayonet stakes. Yes, of course.
The really strange thing about this collection, as opposed to the Tales from One Pocket, is that all of the stories in this one, with a couple of exceptions, seem to be recounted tales.
I was going to say, it reminds me of people, sitting around the campfire telling horror stories. It feels like the characters, the perspective we're following, are almost trying to solve the mysteries in their head, even though they've already been solved. Because these stories, and this is a shift that's kind of gradual in the first pocket, but right in our face, these stories are not about solving murder mysteries. They're about solving the problems that surround them and the kind of context of a mystery in someone's life.
Yeah, they're very deconstructive of the genre as a whole, which is something we spoke about a lot on the previous episode. But Herds, what is this story deconstructing? I assume you chose it for some slightly more loftier reason other than it being the funniest one.
Well, so my kind of thought process here, because it is the funniest one. It's also the first one in the book, which makes it like really great as a kind of a way to ease the author in.
Yeah.
Because the second story we're going to talk about is a lot darker than this one.
Yes.
So, we got light and funny, and that's what we do on this show. But I think that there's something to be said for the kind of absurdist angle that it takes in showing that our obsession with solving mysteries and getting inside the criminal mind, all of that could be kind of pointless in a sense. It's not something that is required for a good story. I don't think that this is a story that you need to be intellectual to solve or figure out. There is none of that. It's just a group of friends chatting about an absurd situation they found themselves in. And I love the way that we explore this criminal because they're kind of a derp. They're not this criminal Moriarty trying to outwit the detective. They're just a very simple cactus thief who enjoys the prickling of a supple cacti in their bosom. That's a thing.
Just
best line. The best line in the whole story, honestly.
Why did Karel Čapek do this to me?
I don't know, but I love it.
Why did he feel the need to write that line? It's so out of place.
No, it's beautiful.
The scene stops to let that line happen, and I was just left dumbfounded as to why.
I love it. This character, I'm going to say Raychek. I think this character...
Bit of a Falc's pass.
A Falc's pass. Ray check. That's what we're going with. He's a derp. He's really just stealing these cacti because he has a passion for it.
Yeah.
He's not doing it out of any malice, and he almost seems kind of confused when he's caught. And he, even at the end, they're saying, "We got to take all your cacti away now, sir. Those rightfully belong to someone else." He says, "Can't I just serve time? I don't want to lose my beautiful thorned mistresses."
There is something kind of excellent, and I won't spoil the ending to our previous book, but there is kind of an excellent parallel to the weird, out of place ending in our last story. Compared to this one where it's like, oh, well, instead of being punished, we'll just send you off to Mexico to look into more cacti.
And then he dies anyway because he's too much of a fool. It's so good. Well, but it still ties into that concept of criminal justice, right? Yeah. In that, in a story where we're presented with a very serious detective and a very serious murderer, the end result is that one of them is hanged.
Yes.
Because that's the punishment for being a criminal and doing a murder. But in this story, we have this character who has done something so insignificant, but it's conflated so much by the characters that love these cacti that it's only fitting that they still receive the capital punishment, but it's in the most absurd, out of the blue way possible.
I suppose. I think the thing that more stood out to me in this story was it felt like this story was breaking down what it meant to be the audience in detective fiction.
Sure.
Where we have, the opening page, it's already talking about, oh, look, Czech is a rich and precise language. It's kind of making fun of the lofty way, I guess, we talk about these mystery stories.
I feel that.
When ultimately it's like, this is a petty theft.
Yes.
And has nothing to do with us.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And if you look at the way that they address it, they say they get 2 amateur detectives and they put an ad in the newspaper and things escalate and they have this whole scheme about these cacti gay disease in a situation where it doesn't really need to.
Yeah.
And I love that.
It's also, everything is very gossipy.
Yes.
Like a lot of the ways that we look at alibis and the ways that suspects present themselves in murder mystery fiction is, all very he said, she said, pointing out, oh, well, I heard that this other person was more suspicious than me.
Yes. Oh, the 2 cacti, cults. I loved them.
Yeah. And I think that that's kind of very reflective here, though. It's a really obscure way to deconstruct that relative to some of the very precise deconstructions we got in the tales from the first pocket.
That's intentional. I think that the kind of vagueness that we feel in this opening chapter to the second half is very much designed to ease ourselves into it. That's the vibe that I definitely got from the other stories, because by the time, and we'll talk about this when we get to an ordinary murder, but things are going to get very real very quickly if you read all of these stories in order.
Yeah. And I think probably the most specific deconstruction we had in this story was the passage where we get the fake Harvard-Lotson solution.
Oh, yeah?
Which is obviously meant to be paralleling that trope in detective fiction where we have the detective put out the false solution to try bait the culprit in.
Right, yeah.
It's something that we've seen a lot in some of the stories, both off the show and on the show, but I liked the way that it just absolutely made light of it by just saying, oh, yeah, it's just a newspaper clipping, and the guy came in and it's like, oh, it doesn't exist. It just sets it up and gets rid of it within 2 lines, and it's such a brilliant moment of demonstrating the pace in this story.
Yes.
Obviously it's 6 pages long. So
this is the thing. I read this whole story through and then I came back to it just before we did the show and I was like, wow, it really was just that short. There are only really, 4 major events that happen and each of them are a page or 2 long. It's crazy.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about it, as I say, that moment feels like it sets a good pace. But not to say that it feels laboriously slow.
No.
But the story feels longer than it is.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is a really interesting aspect of its writing where we get a lot done at a slow pace that still feels like we're fitting a lot. Am I making sense here?
I think you're making some sense.
The antithesis to how I'm explaining this point is how the story is.
The opposite of what you're saying or how you're saying it.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, it feels like there's a lot more meat here, right?
Yeah.
It feels chunky, which I know is a terrible way of explaining things, but that's how it feels. This story has so much in it, it's such a small space. It's like a pudding in a bowl,
Personally, I'm just very glad that the story didn't do anything ridiculous like expect us to know the science of cactus. Oh yes, there was this much water in the cactus, and thus the criminal could only have been someone who was seen dehydrated the following day.
Well, it's funny, isn't it, that we are still using criminal psychology of a sense to catch the criminal. We don't actually have to understand the diseases, the various diseases that could affect a cactus. and yet it is still part of the solution.
It is.
Device X, so to speak.
Yeah, I love a good old device X.
When it's implemented well.
Well.
And in this case, in a sense that you don't actually have to understand the various diseases. You don't have to understand device X, just that it's being used to catch a culprit.
Well, either way, that has been the Cactus Thief. The Stolen Cactus, whichever name your edition of the
whatever
story
you
has
want.
it.
Honestly, if you steal a cactus, you get to name it whatever you want. You're the thief. That's
Just
your job.
don't steal it like Rake did, or Rachk, or
Rachek.
Reich, or whatever Falx Pass
Let
we
us
choose to
know
pronounce
on
his
the
name
socials at Flex and Herds. Let us know how to pronounce that name, because I could not figure it out for the life of me.
This is Flex and Herds. You're listening to Death of the Reader. And right now we are joined by Andrew B. Patterson, Australian crime fiction author and former police officer who has been involved with Western Australia's child abuse and vice units, as well as ICAC. A man who, despite Google's insistent attempts to convince me otherwise, is not actually the aftermath of a run-in between Australian poet Banjo Patterson and the Elixir of Life.
It's amazing how many times on Google Banjo Patterson's name is spelt incorrectly.
Yeah, I imagine you have a similar struggle to us, because we have our show named after an academic theory that's very, very famous in academic circles. So anytime someone Googles our show, even if they type our name correctly, it comes up with the similar academic theory ahead of us, and it's like, damn you!
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's all right. That's what this show's all about, clearing up the confusion surrounding Google's search engine.
All right, so Andrew, you are an author of noir crime, of hard-boiled crime. You know, typically we deal with the slightly cozier side of detective fiction and puzzles on this show. What is it that you enjoy most about noir above our cozy circles?
For me, the hard-boiled and noir, and I'll use the terms together. I mean, we can have arguments about definitions, and we're not going to go there. But for me, it's the characterization and the hard side of it, and putting across what actually goes on out there. And for me, that's one of the motivations in writing crime in the first place, to put out to people, this is what goes on out there, which is why some of what I write is not very pleasant. I'm very much into the realism side of it. So the hard-boiled appeals from that perspective.
Yeah, so you maintain a list of cops writing crime fiction that you refer to as the squad. What are those benefits that the realism that former law enforcement members bring to crime fiction, and how does that contribute to what you enjoy about the genre?
I think the fact that the authors who have been out there on the streets and doing police work, they can bring what I'd call it the brush strokes of police life to the page, and it just gives those, even sometimes even only small nuances, but it just gives it that realistic touch. I first read, when I was a young uniformed officer, I read Joseph Wombo, who was probably I'd say the first big name in terms of ex-police who wrote crime fiction. And it really just resonated, despite the fact he was writing about cops in Los Angeles. I was a cop in Perth, which by comparison was quite sleepy to LA. But the realism and just the way the police interact and how they get on and do their jobs, and in some cases survive their jobs, is quite fascinating, I think.
Do you find that influence extends much beyond crime fiction? I know one of my favorite musicians is an ex-police officer, and a lot of the lyrics that band deals with tend to deal with his life as a police officer.
Apart from writing what you know, I think it's also wanting to put stories out there. And to me, one of the, I suppose, almost cathartic aspects of it is that in fiction, you can get a level of justice that you can't always get in real life. Or perhaps a level of injustice as well. But
yeah.
In your article earlier this year for the Mystery Readers Journal, you said that, we've been reading up. One of the most important things authors can do is to read, and to read a lot. Yeah. How do you find that helps your writing process?
I think it broadens your perspective in terms of both concepts for writing and also the way language is used. I love the English language. It's wonderful to work with. And I think seeing how the writers express things, both ideas and how they draw characters, I think you can gain a lot from that. Obviously, you don't want to step over the line into starting to plagiarise or copy too heavily. Yeah. But I think it really broadens your mind in terms of what writing can achieve. And, I mean, there's so many good authors out there.
So you self-publish your works, largely, you say, to keep editorial control.
Yep.
Do you ignore someone if they come and say, this part of the story goes too far? Because a lot of your editorial control seems to be about keeping the gritty realism of it. So where do you draw that line on feedback of, like, what's acceptable to put in and out of your books?
To me, it's about, does the story work?
Yeah.
And so I do have both the novels that I've self-published. I have had a professional editor do an edit towards the end of the editing process because I definitely want that extra set of eyes. As you guys would know, you go blind to your own stuff. And people point things out and you think, I've read that 10 times. How did I miss it? But you do. But no, particularly in terms of just are there bits of the story that jar or that they don't work, or are there bits about characters which don't work for the reader? So those sort of bits of feedback I'll certainly take on. And look, in both instances, with both of the editors that I had do the books, and they were different ones, I took on board 80 to 90% of what the feedback they gave me. And there are a few bits I beg to differ. Well, I maintain that right. But so that at the end of the day, you are writing for readers. So you want the story to work. The aspect of editorial control to me is about keeping in those bits which I think, I think we're down to 4 main commercial publishing houses now here in Australia. Editors at those will make commercial decisions, and that's fine. They are there to make money. They may look at parts and think, no, that's simply too gritty for our reader, for the readership. That's too explicit. So that's what I mean by editorial control. I'm happy to have the editorial feedback in terms of how does the story flow and how's the language used, and that's all good stuff to hear back. But look, bottom line is I don't want somebody telling me you can't say that. Especially
you're writing fiction, but you're writing based on a wide breadth of real experiences, very personal experiences. Yep. How do you manage your emotional health when putting down on paper such depth of corruption and misery and all that for your audience?
I think I'm going to use the word I used a little bit earlier on. It's very cathartic in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Because, yes, it's fiction. I think the phrase is inspired by real events. But it's all fiction, and if I ever end up in court, I'll be maintaining it is fiction. But it really is about being able to tell the stories. And I think the emotional hard bits were living those real things in the first place. And I mean, that was something that struck me in reading the Čapek short story here about compartmentalisation of things, which we'll talk about in due course, no doubt.
Yeah.
But really, I find it emotionally a very good experience because you're getting a lot of stuff out. And on that level, I guess it's a bit like having a good vent,
Yeah. Jumping over to your actual writing now from kind of these broad strokes about your work, in what ways does your detective reflect your own work as a detective, and where do you differ from him?
Okay, well, I will say at the outset I'm not Harry Kenmare. There are certainly aspects of him which are very much from me as a person. Obviously, the backstory, he was a detective sergeant in the police, so was I. He got kicked out. I hasten to add I didn't. I left of my own steam. But I think, and some of the experiences he's had, obviously, I've drawn from my experiences. It's easier to write, for me, a character like Harry because that's obviously, he's around the same age as me, similar experiences. The harder bits to write are, for instance, writing the female characters, the twins. It's clearly, and this is where I had some interesting feedback, both from the editor in the first book and also from my sister who overseas who reads the drafts saying, no, it wouldn't work for a young girl. Okay, great.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
And in fact, both books, the editors have been females, and I've done that deliberately.
Yeah, no.
So to get that other perspective.
I think that's always a very sensible choice, making sure that your editors actually do come in with a different perspective. Because, I mean, obviously, even for us on this show, we come from a very similar perspective on crime fiction. So sometimes we'll be talking about a point and then someone will walk into the room and say, this doesn't make any sense. It's just like, okay, all right, tell me more.
Yeah. Help me out here.
Yeah.
So your third book, starring Harry, is on the way. Did you know where you want to conclude the series when you started?
Short answer, no. Look, the genesis of the first book, Harry's World, originally I wrote, going right back to the very start of it. I had back when I was doing some university studies, I had a unit I was doing in criminology. And one of the assignments, which was a fascinating assignment, was to take a line of Raymond Chandler, and there were 4, I think from memory, offered. And of course, he's one of the greats on hard-boiled, wonderful use of language. And then you had to write a 500-word story, starting with that as the opening line. The third book, which is just due to other pressures in life, is very slim at this stage. But
slim is not zero.
No, it's not. That's right. There is a start there, and I'm also working on a book of short stories at the same time. But I know where he wants to go. I want to have him by the end of the third book. Are there going to be more books after that? Look, I'm going to have to wait and see. I want to see how I feel about it. Look, all things going well. Third novel, Harry's Grail is its title. Should be out hopefully about this time next year.
Looking forward to it. All right. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us on Death of the Reader. And
my pleasure.
You've given away a bit earlier that we've spoken with you about Karel Čapek here, and we're going to get you to stick around, talk about our next story in Ordinary Murder in just a second. You're listening to Death of the Reader. You're listening to Death of the Reader. We are Flex and Herds. This is your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are continuing our discussion on Karel Čapek's Tales from Two Pockets. Right now, we are discussing a tale from the second half of this collection, and Ordinary Murder. We still have Andrew Patterson in with us, who kindly agreed to read this story, which I'm so glad, because I really think you'd love it given your style of crime and the kind of things that you deal with. And I think this is also probably one of my favorite ones in the collection. It was a good pick, Hertz.
Thank you. I had to flick through them to begin with. I was like, which one of these looks interesting? Which one of these do we think would be good for the show? And I read the opening of Naughty Murder and I said, this has blown me away. There is no more depressing yet somehow interesting story I've read in a very long time. So we had to talk about it. A perfectly ordinary murder with nothing exciting or interesting about it. And that's what makes it so good.
Yeah. I think it's an excellent story. We deal basically with the aftermath of the murder of a character called Mrs. Takova.
A lovely old lady.
As with many of the stories in the second half of this collection, it's told from the spoken perspective of someone who was there at the time of the crime. And I really enjoy the way that it gets into our storyteller's psyche. I think that it's really fascinating how we get to look at this very deconstructive perspective on what it feels to be adjacent to a crime, the people involved, the emotions.
Yeah, getting sucked into the experience.
Because our perspective, Mr. Hanak, is a former undisclosed rank army leader. And the story deals a lot with him comparing the murder of a single woman to comparing his war experience and digging mass graves.
Mm-hmm. The thing that really struck me was how much is compressed into such a short space.
Yeah.
Which I think is that certainly a sign of a brilliant author, being able to say so much, and yet, I mean, look, printed out, it's less than 3 pages.
Yeah.
So obviously we're not getting any plot development or anything like that, but we're getting, I think, a whole lot of facets about crime and society. Even in the opening paragraph, we get the inherent instinct for justice line. I mean, it's almost underplayed there, but it does, I think, set up the story very well, because I mean, I would certainly agree that is a driving force, I think, for most human beings. So I think that's a very profound element, and as I said, it is put in quite an unstated way. I think the other thing that really struck me, and this I reflected back on sort of my own police time as well, because Mr. Hanak talks about obviously being in the front line, I'm presuming the First World War they're referring to. The comparison then to one murdered woman is very starkly drawn. But I think what it's reflecting is that the description of how they put up with the effectively mass murder on the front line is very much about compartmentalising things that are difficult to deal with. And certainly that's the way most police survive aspects of police work. But if you thought about them too much, you'd probably go insane.
I did like the way that it kind of almost inverted the concept of compartmentalizing it as an example when it said that, every corpse should have dozens of people come and look at it so that they can each be appreciated.
I appreciated a bit of kind of visual parallel of the image of a foot in an army boot and the bloodstained hair comparing with the description of the woman lying on the ground with her foot halfway out of the shoe. Like, there's a lot of really, I suppose, punchy descriptions that really lend the parallels of like the war versus this one poor woman who's been killed. And I think the thing that I kind of felt the most was how pitiful the whole thing was, how like the way that Mr. Takova is described is as a beetle that's been disturbed, and the bloodstained curtains. Like, we get this impression that this murder, that when we think of murder mystery novels, we think of these, you sit around at the tea and you discuss murder mysteries. Oh, how droll this is, the vicars at the estate having tea with you, that sort of thing. But reframing this oh so fun murder mystery as a real person's been killed and she's got a starring role as a corpse.
Yes.
I found that to be really impactful myself.
Yeah, I think the other detail that's really interesting in there, you mentioned the kind of comparison between the body of the soldier and the body of the woman and how they're described very similarly.
Yeah.
In that, because this is a short story and there's so little time between those comparisons, that it's so upfront.
Yep, it's very in your face.
And one description that really shone me, and you referred to the dead lady's hair.
Yes.
But where it was so painstakingly braided and it shone like old pewter among the congealed rivulets of blood.
Yeah.
I think that,
Tingles.
In that one part sentence, the level of description is magnificent. Yep.
I think the other important part of this story to me is actually there's a line break on the last page of the story, which is such a subtle detail. Like normally, you deal with a line break and it's like, oh, we've jumped a bit in time. But this line break is literally just the next person starts speaking. And I think that Karel Čapek has put that gap there to show like, this is where we're now dealing with the culprit as opposed to the victim. And that makes that transition feel so much more weighty. And it's such like a minor writing detail, but I love the way that it's used.
Yeah, and I think the way the culprit's described there is also very human. And I think that then... And of course, we never find out what the motivation for the murder is. But I think by humanising the killer at the end, I think that adds a layer of tragedy to the whole thing.
Yeah.
They seem like a victim. The way that they're described as I believe they're about to take away to be vivisected is the terminology used, like a deer in the headlights. It reminds me of a saying that I heard someone say that there's a moment where you realize that every person's experience around you is as vivid as your own. And even though it's highlighted that he only sees the culprit for a total of 5 seconds, the imprint that this person has on their life is so profound.
Yeah.
I believe that was the definition of the word sonder, which was actually, coincidentally enough, the title of the last album from the musician I mentioned in our previous discussion.
Well, there you go. It all comes back around.
Full circle, completely
We've
unplanned.
done it. They don't believe that. The audience don't believe that.
I did also like the way this entire collection has been very deconstructive of the murder mystery genre. We've spoken about that over this and last episode and how it breaks down all of the different components of the story and shows you where there are problems if these were real scenarios and where there are problems in, you couldn't actually write an academic text based on murder mystery reasoning. That's absolutely nonsense. And I really like the way that this culprit being shown this way kind of sticks it in your face and says, this is the life that you are basically giving to the person that you've ascribed the culprit to in all of your other favorite murder mystery stories. I think that there's something very powerful about that image, particularly if you're coming at this story from a conventional reader of cozy crime. Like, it might be cozy, but this is the outcome.
Yep. Here's the mirror, turning it back to you. There's you. Look at these horrible things you're doing, detectives.
Yeah, so that is Tales from Two Pockets. That has been our discussion on it. An Ordinary Murder, Fall of House Vodicki, there's Cactus Thief, The Disappearance of an Actor, and of course this mystery collection is 48 stories long.
There's so many of them. How would we read them all?
In order, ideally.
I hope so. I hope you read them in order.
I mean, you really could just open up at any page and go with any of them, but
you could.
I think that there is a bit of a logical flow to the way that they're planned out through the collection. I'd like to thank you again, Andrew, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. I really loved your perspective on this story and getting to hear about your own work.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on board.
Now, Herds.
Thank you for not stealing any of my points. I appreciate that.
But you know what we do have points for, Herds? We have points on the table for the audience over the next 2 weeks because we have Supporter Drive coming up on 2SER. It is 2 weeks that we take off to show you all the best that we have on 2SER. We're going to be doing a live show from 7 to 9:30 p.m.
That's like 2.5 hours of us.
It is a little insane. I'm a little scared. I've packed supplies. I'm bracing for the apocalypse.
Yeah. I brought so much water. I'm going to be a full tank of water. It's going to sit in the studio. You'll be very careful with it. We're going to stay hydrated.
Keep an eye on our socials at Flex and Herds on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're going to be posting some short mystery stories there that you can solve along. Maybe call into the show, maybe just send us a message. We have picked our next story for after Supporter Drive. It's sitting on the table right in front of us here. Herds, could you tell us a little bit about this book?
It is Sins for Father Knox. I might say the paperback is beautiful. It's by Josef Skvorecky.
Good try.
Skvorecky. Unpronounceable, I think is what I'm going to refer to him from now on. It's by another Czechoslovakian author, and it's fantastic. It's written in response to, Western murder mystery fiction, and it's basically 10 short stories, and each of them breaks a different rule of Knox's commandments.
Now, Andrew,
it's great.
You mentioned Raymond Chandler earlier. I found out that Josef Skvorecky actually started writing mystery fiction after reading and translating Raymond Chandler into his native Czechoslovakian.
Okay.
So I'm very excited to get to this story, breaking down the rules of One Father Ronald Knox.
I'm looking forward to making my comeback. It's gonna happen. I'm gonna win this.
This has been Death of the Reader. We are Flex and Herds. We will see you next week. We're out of here.
See you next time.